Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, if we had to pick just one single image, one face that sort of defines modern existential dread, that feeling of isolation, the fear, just the sheer crushing weight of being alive, it would probably be this man's work.
It probably would.
We are going way beyond the poster today. We're looking into the extraordinary, often chaotic life of Edvard Munch, the Norwegian master.
Yeah, and it's so easy, isn't it, to just boil Munch down to that one incredibly famous image, the scream. I mean, it's basically become global shorthand for modern angst.
Right.
It's this representation of the anxious mind that sits right up there with the huge cultural touchstones.
Yeah.
You know, the Mona Lisa, Whistler's mother. Everyone recognizes it.
But maybe they don't fully get it.
Exactly. Often universally misunderstood, I'd say.
So our mission today for you listening is to really move past the meme, past the posters, and unpack the sheer volume of trauma, illness, and psychological turmoil that actually fueled his art. Munch wasn't just like observing the world through a window pane. He was painting what he felt deep inside, in his very bones. His life was, well, essentially the raw source material for pretty much every stroke of his brush.
That's absolutely the key distinction here. I mean, you think about his contemporaries, right? Many were caught up in the science of light, impressionism, or observing social life naturalism.
Yeah.
Munch was obsessed with the interior world, the psyche. He really forms the foundation for both symbolism and expressionism because his goal was so deeply personal, almost forensic in a way.
Florenzi, I like
He
it.
stated it pretty clearly himself. In my art, I attempt to explain life and its meaning to myself. It was self-exploration.
And we're going to trace that attempt today. It was volatile, certainly. We'll explore how his bohemian nihilism and that just overwhelming family history led him directly to this concept to develop a soul painting.
Right.
And it all begins really tragically right back in the dark corners of his childhood. So let's unpack this heavy inheritance, starting back in, 1863?
Yeah, 1863. The foundation of Munch's whole worldview, you could argue, was laid immediately by loss. He was born in Adelsbruck, Norway. His father, Christian Munch, was a doctor, but his mother, Laura, she died of tuberculosis in 1868. Edvard was just 5 years old.
Just 5. And this wasn't like an isolated incident, was it? It was really the start of what the sources call this tragedy stack. Tuberculosis consumption, as they called it then. It was just this devastating, constant presence in their lives.
Constantly looming.
And the sources really emphasize that 9 years later, in 1877, Munch had to watch his favorite sister, Johann Sophie, who was apparently quite artistic herself, die of the exact same disease. She was only 15.
15. That double bereavement. First his mother, then his sister. It gave Munch this incredibly early, intimate, and frankly horrifying understanding of death's inevitability. It was right there in the house.
But the tragedy didn't stop with consumption, did it?
No, unfortunately not. His other sister, Laura, she was diagnosed with mental illness quite early on. Eventually, she was institutionalized. So the domestic circle, the family unit, it was just permanently fractured, permanently shadowed.
Wow.
Munch himself felt he had inherited, this is his quote, two of mankind's most frightful enemies, the heritage of consumption and insanity.
That's a heavy burden to feel you carry genetically.
Immense, and it's almost impossible to overstate the psychological toll of this perceived, genetic curse.
Oh.
It led directly to that deeply famous, quite harrowing quote where he claimed, "The angels of fear, sorrow, and death stood by my side since the day I was born."
And you read that, and you might think it's just artistic rhetoric, maybe laying it on a bit thick. But the sources suggest, no, this was a genuine reflection of the morbid, intense environment created primarily by his father after the mother's death.
Absolutely. Christian Munch became this central, dominant psychological influence. After his wife died, he became obsessively religious, leaning into this really severe nervous form of morbid pietism. He raised the children alone, but, well, the way he entertained them.
Yeah, tell us about that. It sounds unsettling.
It was. He entertained them with ghost stories, these incredibly macabre, dark tales by Edgar Allan Poe. Imagine that for young kids.
Combined with intense religion, that's quite a mix.
It's a psychological pressure cooker, exactly. On one hand, he's filling their heads with these visceral, dark, macabre visions. On the other, he's applying immense spiritual pressure. He constantly reprimanded the children for the slightest misbehavior by telling them that their deceased mother was up in heaven grieving over their bad actions.
Oh, the guilt. That's immense.
An enormous burden of guilt and spiritual anxiety placed squarely on Edvard and his siblings. And then you add poverty into the mix. The family lived in what's described as genteel but perennial poverty, The father's private medical practice wasn't successful.
So constant moving, instability.
Yes, constantly moving between cheap flats. That combination, poverty, the fear of eternal condemnation, the ghost stories, it all inspired the nightmares and the deep, dark visions that really defined his later subject matter. You see the roots right there.
It's interesting, too, that the sources emphasize this perpetual poverty because he was often ill himself, right?
Yeah.
Kept home from school during the cold Norwegian winters. And what did he do? He drew constantly. And that constrained life, it's almost visible even in those very early subjects he chose to draw. Medicine bottles, drawing implements, the small, maybe suffocating interiors of their homes.
He was practically charting his symptoms, wasn't he? Both the physical ones and the emotional ones, long before he had the artistic vocabulary like expressionism to describe it. And then when he eventually took that leap, deciding to become a professional artist, this crushing biographical weight, this family history, it was immediately weaponized against him by critics.
That's a crucial point, because when his painting The Sick Child, which was such a direct, raw memorial to his sister Sophie's death, when that was first displayed in Oslo in 1886, the critics didn't just, critique the technique. They got personal, viciously so.
They absolutely turned his biography into a critical bludgeon, straight up accused him of being a madman, declared his art was insane. Why? Simply because he derived from an insane family, clearly referencing his sister Laura's diagnosis.
So that societal rejection must have just poured fuel on the fire of his own deep-seated fear, which he often expressed, of succumbing to hereditary insanity himself.
Exactly. It reinforced everything he already feared.
It really seems like he was walking this incredibly fine line his whole life, didn't it? Balancing this intense, almost compulsive creativity against genuine psychological instability. Which leads us to that fascinating, though obviously delicate insight in the sources regarding his specific psychological profile.
It does. And, we have to be careful here. We can't offer a definitive historical diagnosis from this distance.
Of course not.
But the sources do note that in reviewing his life, his documented behavior, his writings, some modern analysis has suggested he may have exhibited symptoms consistent with what we now call borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Okay, so that raises an essential question then. How would the typical symptoms of BPD, things like chronic feelings of emptiness, an intense fear of abandonment, maybe highly impulsive behavior, how did those align with the historical record we have of Munch's life and actions?
Well, the alignment is quite compelling. Based on the sources, you definitely see the impulsivity, right? It's clearly there in his documented propensity for heavy drinking, for brawling within his bohemian circles, especially later on before his treatment.
Okay.
And the intense, often chaotic, and sometimes volatile nature of his main intimate relationships, particularly the Tula Larsen incident, which I know we'll get into later, that speaks pretty directly to both that fear of abandonment and maybe the subsequent self-destructive impulse that's often associated with BPD.
So he was really fighting these internal demons that then translated into external volatility.
Precisely. And you can see how this background, this internal chaos, maybe made the structured world of academic art, the expected path, just impossible for him to follow. He did try initially, though. He tried to satisfy his father's professional expectations, started technical college in 1879, planning to study engineering, and apparently he excelled in science and math, ironically showing quite an analytical mind early on.
That it didn't last long.
Barely a year. He abandoned the engineering track in 1880. He was just drawn instead to the messy and what his father saw as the, quote, unholy trade of art.
And that decision, going into art, it was met with profound distress at home, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. His father was bitterly disappointed. Apparently, Munch even received anonymous letters from neighbors condemning his choice. Can you imagine?
Wow. But his resolve was absolute, it seems. He enrolled at the Royal School of Art and Design in Christiania, that's Oslo now, in 1881.
And he spent the next few years really searching for his own voice. He experimented widely, dabbling in naturalism, then trying Impressionism. But his experimentation was aggressive right from the start, often met with outright scorn.
Like that portrait of Carl Jensen-Hill.
Exactly. The portrait of his bohemian friend, Carl Jensen-Hill, which earned the incredibly dismissive review. It is Impressionism carried to the extreme. It is a travesty of art. Ouch.
Yeah, no holding back there. And the sources tell us this negative criticism had real consequences, not just for his reputation, but for his actual survival as an artist. His father, Christian, already prone to moral panic.
He was swayed by these reviews, and he physically destroyed at least one of Munch's paintings, likely an early nude, which would have particularly offended his piety, and then he cut off financial support for Munch's art supplies.
So that tension must have been immense, the need for financial support, maybe some family validation, versus this internal drive toward radical self-expression.
It pushed him directly into the orbit of probably the most dangerous but also most influential intellectual figure in Christianity at the time, Hans Jæger.
Ah, Jæger, the local nihilist anarchist figure living by that provocative code. A passion to destroy is also a creative passion. So how did this relationship with Jæger fundamentally alter Munch's artistic path?
Jæger basically acted as a kind of dark mentor figure. He commanded Munch, literally commanded him, to write his life, essentially urging him to stop looking outward, stop objective observation, and turn inwards towards profound, unfiltered self-examination.
Like keeping a diary.
Exactly.
Mm.
This impulse was formalized when Munch began meticulously recording his feelings, his anxieties, his thoughts, his reactions in what he specifically called his soul's diary. And the core shift happened right there. Munch decided that art must be confession. It has to come from within.
And this intense self-focus, this turn inward, it naturally led him to reject the prevailing art style of the late 19th century, didn't it? He found Impressionism, even with its focus on light and momentary sensation, well, he found it lacking.
He called it superficial and too akin to scientific experimentation, which is a strong statement, really.
It is. Why do you think he viewed that scientifically rigorous approach to capturing light as just insufficient for what he needed to do?
Because he was searching for much deeper emotional and psychological content, stuff that went way beyond just capturing a fleeting moment on a canvas. He wanted to depict the eternal states, the big themes, jealousy, death, love, anxiety, not just a hazy sunset.
Right.
He felt Impressionism really only dealt with the surface of things, whereas he needed to expose the raw nerve underneath.
Yeah.
The feeling itself.
And this is where his idea of soul painting really emerges then.
Precisely. And the first definitive break from Impressionism, the first true example of this new style, was The Sick Child in 1886. We mentioned the reaction. It was this raw, heavily textured attempt to capture the agony and atmosphere of his sister Sophie's death. He used scumbled paint, really rough technique, and almost brutal focus on the subject and the feeling in the room.
And public outcry was immediate, right? But thankfully, he did have at least one powerful defender in the establishment, Christian Krogh.
Yes, Krogh, who was actually one of his early teachers. Krogh praised the work, importantly, noting that Munch sees only the essential. He stated that Munch's pictures are complete because he really knows how to show us what he has felt and what has gripped him.
That validation must have been crucial, the idea that the emotional truth mattered more than the academic finish.
It was everything for him at that stage, I think. And this focus on internal truth, it was really bolstered when he won a state scholarship to go to Paris in 1889. Now, apparently, he found the academic drawing lessons at Léon Bonnat's studio pretty boring.
Figures.
But the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair, essentially, that was a revelation for him.
Because he saw the post-impressionists. People who were already making similar moves away from pure realism.
Exactly. He was exposed specifically to Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. He saw how they used color expressively, symbolically.
And Gauguin was particularly important.
Critically influential, yes. Gauguin preached this anti-realism credo that, quote, art was human work and not an imitation of nature. That was like the intellectual permission structure Munch needed. It validated the idea that his dark, anxious interior world was a legitimate, maybe even necessary subject for art.
There's that quote from one of his friends.
Oh yeah, that Munch need not make his way to Tahiti to see and experience the primitive and human nature. He carries his own Tahiti within him. A brilliant observation.
It really is. And then the death of his father in late 1889 while Munch was still in Paris. That must have removed the final anchor, perhaps, to traditional domestic life and expectations.
It seems so. That event, combined with his adoption of Jæger's nihilistic philosophy back in Christiania, and now this exposure to synthetism and expressive color in Paris, it all cemented his commitment to creating these vast emotional cycles of work. The stage was really set for his major mature project, which would properly explode onto the scene, maybe surprisingly, in Berlin. So by 1892, Munch had really formulated his own original synthesis style. This is the moment where he starts consistently treating color not just as descriptive of light or objects, but as a symbolic, emotional entity in itself.
Like in Melancholy from 1891.
Exactly. In Melancholy, that curving shoreline, the figure. The color green isn't just the grass. It becomes synonymous with despair, with that heavy feeling. Color is emotion.
And this radical subjectivity, this focus on inner feeling, it immediately generated controversy when he was invited to exhibit in Berlin in 1892, what became known as the Munch Affair. It sounds like a public relations catastrophe.
For the organizers, maybe? But as Munch saw it, it was resounding success. The show was so controversial, the subject matter, the shocking, seemingly unfinished technique, it was shut down after just 1 week due to public outcry.
What were they objecting to specifically?
The raw depictions of sexuality, of emotional agony,
Mm-hmm.
things like jealousy, death, it just outraged the conservative German art establishment at the time. But Munch, he was apparently delighted by the chaos. He wrote back home, "Never have I had such an amusing time. It's incredible that something as innocent as painting should have created such a stir."
Huh. He knew how to use notoriety.
He certainly did. He capitalized on it, spending the next 4 years based mainly in Berlin. He fell in with this circle of intellectual figures, writers, artists, most famously the Swedish dramatist August Strindberg, whom he painted. And it was during this fertile, if controversial, Berlin period that he properly conceptualized his life's major work, The Frieze of Life, a poem about life, love, and death.
The Frieze of Life, that's the big one.
It's the magnum opus. This cycle, which he first displayed parts of as Study for a Series, Love, in 1893, was intended to be this vast visual sequence depicting the major emotional stations of human existence. You know, the awakening of love, the pain of betrayal, jealousy, anxiety, and of course the inevitable confrontation with death.
It was huge, ambitious, designed to be seen almost as a continuous, looping narrative of human suffering and, well, maybe occasional joy?
Maybe occasional joy, but certainly intense feeling. And we should probably discuss some of those central motifs that define the Frieze, because they tap so directly into his own biographical fears and obsessions.
Definitely. We have Madonna, for instance, which is fascinating because it seems to depict a figure that is simultaneously sacred, beautiful, but also somehow profane, sexualized.
That ambiguity is key to Munch.
Yeah.
And then there's the infamous Love and Pain, which got retitled by a critic, actually, as Vampire.
Vampire. Why is that one so crucial?
Because it really embodies Munch's deep ambivalence, his conflicted feelings towards women and intimacy. It shows a man burying his face into the neck of a woman with this cascade of long flame-red hair. Is it solace he's seeking? Or is it total submission, being drained?
It's ambiguous.
Highly ambiguous.
Yeah.
He seemed to see women both as these innocent sufferers, like his mother and sister, but also potentially as destructive, jealous, consuming figures. It's a psychological split you see running throughout his work related to love and relationships.
And we also see the literal translation of his own family trauma right there in the Frieze paintings, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Death in the Sick Room is particularly powerful in that regard, because it doesn't actually focus on the dying person, on Sophie. Instead, it portrays his entire isolated family, his father, his brother Andreas, his sisters Laura and Inger, as these separate, disconnected figures of sorrow. They're standing side by side in the room, but they're rigid, utterly alone in their grief, no connection.
Chilling. And formally, technically, he was developing specific visual tricks, you could say, to convey this internal experience, right? These emotional states.
He was. He started deliberately using these thick, visible shadows and rings of color around figures. You see it clearly in works like Anxiety or later in Metabolism. They're meant to emphasize an aura of fear or anxiety or maybe sexual intensity.
So it's not a realistic shadow. It's like an emotional atmosphere made visible.
Exactly. It's an immediate visual translation of the emotional weather surrounding the figure, rather than just painting their skin tone or how light falls on them.
Can you describe that a bit more? Like, if you, the listener, were standing in front of Anxiety, what would those rings of color actually look like? How do they function?
Well, they look less like natural shadows cast by light and much more like vibrating halos of psychic energy almost. In Anxiety, you see those ghostly figures walking towards you, their faces pale, maybe greenish. And the air around them, the water, the hills, the sky, it's painted in these swirling, often blood red or deep blue rings and waves. It strongly suggests that the environment itself is reflecting and intensifying their internal state of dread, like the air is chemically reacting to their fear.
That's incredibly powerful. And he wasn't afraid of pushing the technical boundaries of paint itself either. The sources mention he began using highly diluted paint, allowing deliberate drips, visible brushwork, making it look almost messy on purpose.
Yes, like in At the Deathbed from 1895, it was almost a controlled chaos, a controlled messiness. He didn't want the painting to look slick or polished or academically finished. He wanted it to look raw, immediate, physically distressed, mirroring the distress of the subject matter.
And that deliberate use of drips, that visible texture,
Yeah.
that was hugely influential later on, wasn't it?
Hugely. Other artists, particularly the Expressionists who followed, absolutely picked up on that technique.
Okay, so all of this intense, synthesized emotional expression, all the anxiety, the nihilism, the family trauma, the innovative techniques, it all seems to have coalesced into that single image that remains, even today, the absolute face of modern angst. We have to talk about the scream.
The Scream. It's the moment, really, where Munch arguably transcended his own personal trauma and achieved something utterly universal in its expression.
And there isn't just one scream, is there?
No, that's important. It exists in 4 primary versions, 2 painted canvases, 2 pastels created between 1893 and 1910. Plus, he made several lithographs of the image later on to disseminate it more widely.
And the value, astronomical. That 1895 pastel version sold for nearly $120 million back in 2012.
Which tells you something about its perceived importance.
We absolutely have to revisit the origin story for this image, the Genesis moment, because it's captured in Munch's own diary account, and the distinction between what is screaming and who is screaming often gets lost in pop culture references.
Yeah, that diary entry is absolutely foundational to understanding not just this painting, but maybe Expressionism as a whole. Munch wrote that he was walking down a road at sunset with 2 friends.
Yeah.
Suddenly, he writes, the sky turned as red as blood.
Okay.
His friends kept walking, but Munch stopped. He describes leaning against the fence, feeling unspeakably tired, and then shivering with fear. And then comes the crucial line. Then I heard the enormous, infinite scream of nature.
Nature screaming, not the figure.
Exactly. That distinction is critical. It wasn't the figure screaming out. It was the entire chaotic universe screaming through him. The figure becomes this conduit, this receptor, reduced to an almost skull-like embryonic form, hands clamped over its ears to block out the overwhelming noise of modern, anxious existence.
And the composition reinforces that feeling, doesn't it? The swirling blood-red sky, the deep dark blue of the fjord below, those jarring angular lines of the boardwalk rushing towards the viewer.
It's a visual metaphor for complete destabilization, psychological vertigo. This is the moment, Munch later said, that made him feel he had to give up hope ever of being able to love again. It was a profound psychological breakthrough, but one born of genuine personal crisis and anguish.
It's the ultimate voluntary confession, as he called his art. And as the art historian Martha Tedeschi noted, the Scream somehow managed to make that incredible transition from the elite realm of the museum visitor to the enormous venue of popular culture.
It really did. Munch had somehow spoken for millions, maybe, by simply describing the chaotic, terrifying interior of his own mind at that moment.
But even with this incredible artistic breakthrough, this universal image, Munch's personal life, it remained highly turbulent, didn't it? Deeply conflicted in the years immediately following the main Frieze period. And this seemed to reach a really dramatic, almost violent apex in his intense relationship with Tulla Larsen.
Ah, yes, Tulla Larsen, the upper-class, quite liberated woman for the time. Their relationship lasted roughly from about 1899 to 1907, on and off.
And the core issue was marriage.
It seemed so. Larsen apparently pushed desperately for marriage. But Munch, still so burdened by his family's history of consumption and insanity, he firmly refused. He felt, as he stated, that ever since he was a child he had hated marriage. He genuinely seemed to believe he had no right, morally, to bring potentially damaged children into the world.
That deep-seated fear again.
Exactly. And this tension, this push and pull, it led to a really dramatic confrontation between them in 1902. Now, the exact circumstances are still disputed, a bit murky.
But the outcome wasn't.
The outcome was physical and psychologically devastating for Munch. There was an accidental shooting. A revolver went off during a struggle or argument, and it injured 2 of Munch's fingers on his left hand. This event became this new, brutal source of trauma that he immediately, almost compulsively, folded right back into his art.
And the artistic fallout was immediate and incredibly visceral, wasn't it? The humiliation, the rage, he channeled it into these direct confessional actions and paintings.
He literally took a saw, the sources say, and sawed a self-portrait depicting him and Larsen together right down the middle. in half.
Wow. The physical act of cutting the canvas mirroring the emotional severing?
Precisely. And that trauma directly influenced a whole series of extremely heavy, difficult works that followed. The incident is reflected in paintings like Still Life, The Murderess, and maybe most famously in The Death of Marat Verst, which he painted around 1906-07.
Where he paints himself as Marat.
Yes, he portrays himself as the assassinated revolutionary martyr, Marat, lying dead in the bath, and Larsen is depicted as the cold executioner, Charlotte Corday, standing naked and impassive beside him. It starkly showed his view of love, or at least that relationship, as potentially lethal.
So this self-destructive cycle, the intense relationships, the heavy drinking we mentioned, the brawling that was associated with his bohemian circles, it really peaked around 1908, didn't it?
It did. He was, by his own account, verging on madness. He was experiencing hallucinations, intense feelings of persecution. He had clearly reached a breaking point where he knew he had to seek institutional help. He couldn't manage it alone anymore.
So he checked himself into a clinic?
Yes, he admitted himself to Dr. Daniel Jacobson's private clinic in Copenhagen. He stayed there for about 8 months. The treatment was quite rigorous, focused on stabilizing his personality. It included a specialized diet, rest, structure, and crucially, electrification.
Okay, electrification. That sounds dramatic. It's important we clarify for listeners, this wasn't modern electroconvulsive therapy, right? What did that term mean for treating nervous conditions back in the early 20th century?
Right, good point. No, it wasn't ECT as we know it. It typically involved administering very mild, controlled electrical currents to the patient's nerves, sometimes to the limbs, sometimes to the head. The theory at the time, largely unfounded now, was that nervous conditions were caused by a kind of internal electrical imbalance that could be corrected or stimulated.
So maybe less about the electricity itself and more about the structured care.
Quite possibly. While the electrification might seem pseudoscientific to us, the rest, the routine, the clinical detachment provided by Dr. Jacobson's institution, that was probably exactly what Munch needed to break the cycle of anxiety, heavy drinking, and instability.
And the recovery, by all accounts, was dramatic. It ushered in a completely new stylistic phase in his art. He returned to Norway in 1909, apparently a changed artist.
Absolutely. The transition is really fascinating to see in the paintings. His work becomes noticeably more colorful and less pessimistic, as many critics noted. He consciously seemed to leave behind the dense, murky, anxiety-ridden palettes of the Frieze years.
So if we were to look at, say, a pre-1908 Frieze painting like Anxiety or Vampire, and then compare it to a post-1909 work, what specific technical changes would a viewer notice? How did his brushwork and color change?
The change is quite stark, actually. In the Frieze works, the palette is generally dark, heavy, compressed, lots of deep reds, blacks, dark blues, suggesting claustrophobia and inner turmoil. After 1909, after the clinic, he embraces this new style. It's characterized by broad, loose, almost energetic brushstrokes, much more visible texture. He starts using vibrant, high-key colors, pure yellows, greens, bright reds. And importantly, he frequently leaves large areas of the canvas intentionally bare or covered only with white primer.
Giving it more air.
Exactly. The work feels more optimistic, more expansive, certainly less claustrophobic. And technically, he was actively rejecting the heavy use of black, which had so powerfully symbolized death and despair in his earlier iconic works.
And this new, more dynamic style, combined with a stabilized personality, this finally led to proper critical acceptance back home in Norway.
It did. He was knighted with the Royal Order of St. Olaf in 1909, a huge public recognition.
And that public acceptance, in turn, led directly to these major monumental commissions, didn't it? Allowing him to transition, in a way, from being primarily the painter of personal pathology to becoming an artist of national significance.
Yes, he won the major competition to decorate the University of Oslo, the main assembly hall which he worked on between 1914 and 1916.
And those Ala works, like The Sun, History, Alma Mater, they are massive, vibrant canvases, a completely different feel.
Completely different. He was aiming, he said, for a visual expression that was both distinctively Norwegian and universally human. He successfully broadened his scope from the tormented individual soul to something more like the collective spirit, or the life force itself.
And in his later years, did he find a measure of personal peace?
It seems he found a measure of stability and peace, yes, primarily at his various properties in Norway. He frequently returned to his beloved summer house in Åsgård Strand, the coastal town featured in so many earlier paintings. He fondly called it the Happy House. He said, To walk in Osgård Strand is like walking among my paintings. I get so inspired to paint when I am here.
That's lovely.
And later, he settled at his fairly self-sufficient estate called Ekely, near Oslo. He seemed to enjoy celebrating farm life, nature. He even used his workhorse, apparently named Rousseau, as a model frequently.
But even in that relative solitude and stability, that deep self-examination never really stopped, did it? He kept painting self-portraits.
Right up to the end. He continued painting these unflinching self-portraits, which resulted in some incredible late masterpieces like Self-Portrait, Between the Clock and the Bed, painted around 1940-1943, not long before he died. There he stands, looking frail, older but utterly resolute, positioned between a grandfather clock symbolizing finite time and the bed, symbolizing perhaps both birth, death, and the domesticity he never fully embraced. A powerful final statement. Munch died in January 1944 at his home Ekely, right in the middle of the German occupation of Norway during World War II. And his final years and his immediate legacy were sadly but inevitably marred by the political darkness of the Nazi era.
Right, because this is where his position as a key pioneer of Expressionism suddenly became a huge liability, didn't it? In the 1930s and 40s, the Nazis famously condemned modern artists. They labeled their work degenerate art, Ontartet Kunst.
Exactly. Adolf Hitler himself personally denounced these artists, suggesting they were mentally unfit, diseased, un-German.
And this condemnation wasn't just rhetoric. It led to a systematic act of cultural vandalism, basically. The removal of huge amounts of modern art from German museums, including Munch's work.
Yes, 82 of Munch's works were confiscated from German public collections. It was a clear attempt to erase the kind of subjective, introspective, emotionally raw art that he had pioneered. Art that didn't fit the Nazis' narrow, heroic, pseudo-classical aesthetic.
And Munch himself, living under occupation in Norway, he must have lived in constant fear of confiscation, especially since he had amassed his own huge personal collection of his works over the decades.
He did. The sources note he had to hide that massive collection. We're talking hundreds of paintings, thousands of drawings and prints, including some of the very works the Nazis had initially confiscated but then sort of returned through forced purchase, like versions of The Scream and The Sick Child. He kept them hidden away on the second floor of his house in Ekely until his death.
And even his funeral, after he died in January 1944, even that became a final, really tragic act of political appropriation by the occupiers.
It did. Despite his family apparently refusing the offer of a state funeral from the collaborationist government, the Nazi authorities insisted. They essentially hijacked the ceremony and turned it into a propaganda opportunity.
That feels incredibly cynical. How exactly did they manage to spin the funeral of an artist whose work they had officially labeled degenerate? What was the narrative?
Well, they manufactured this narrative of him being a great Norse or Nordic national hero. They tried to erase his connection to cosmopolitan modern art, to Expressionism, and instead tie him purely to some kind of idealized Aryan racial identity.
Gross.
The funeral itself was described as this grotesque spectacle. It featured two enormous wreaths decorated with swastikas, personally signed by major Nazi officials in Norway, like Reichskommissar Jerboven and Vidkun Quisling. And the Nazi-affiliated newspaper Frittfolk proclaimed Munch a shooting star of the Norse race. It was a blatant attempt to create this false impression that he somehow supported their ideology. A final, disgusting violation of this deeply private, often tormented artist.
Yet, despite all that political turbulence and manipulation, Munch's ultimate artistic control, his legacy, was secured by his will, wasn't it? His enormous bequest.
Absolutely. Upon his death, he left his entire remaining body of work, a staggering collection, something like 1,100 paintings, 4,500 drawings, and 18,000 prints. He left it all to the city of Oslo.
Which led to the Munch Museum.
Exactly. It established the Munch Museum, which finally opened in Oslo in 1963. This incredible gift ensures his legacy is preserved and accessible. But the immense value and the symbolic power of these works, especially the famous ones, have led to their own troubled modern history.
You mean the thefts?
The thefts, yes. The high-profile thefts of the Screaming Madonna in 2004 from the Munch Museum itself, and an earlier version of the screen stolen from the National Gallery in Oslo back in 1994, they really highlight the status these works have achieved. They're globally recognized symbols, which unfortunately makes them prime targets for criminals.
And although all the stolen works were eventually recovered, the 2004 theft in particular left the paintings extensively damaged, didn't it? Requiring years of painstaking, meticulous restoration.
Yes, water damage, tears. It's a stark reminder that even after a century, this art remains intensely vulnerable, physically fragile, despite its huge cultural weight.
And the ethical dimensions surrounding his artwork also continue to resonate today, don't they? Especially concerning Nazi-looted art claims.
That's right. We see that Munch's art is still involved in these complex, often difficult controversies regarding works that might have been stolen or forcibly sold under duress from Jewish collectors who were fleeing the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s.
Right. Can you give us any specific examples of those ongoing claims just to illustrate the ethical complexity involved here?
Sure. Well, one key case that was resolved involved a painting called Summer Night at the Beach. It was eventually returned to the granddaughter of Alma Mahler, the composer's widow who had fled the Nazis. But other claims are more complex or ongoing. For instance, claims have been raised by the heirs of prominent Jewish collectors like Kurt Glaser and Hugo Simon for works, including a Madonna lithograph and a painting called Dance on the Beach.
So these cases really underscore that Munch's works aren't just, items traded on the art market. They are inextricably tied to the trauma, the history, the displacement of the mid-20th century.
They absolutely are. History clings to them.
But despite these controversies, maybe even partly because of the notoriety, there is that undeniable, staggering market dominance that cements his influence, right? That $120 million sale of the pastel scream is just one indicator of his seemingly eternal value in the global art market.
Yeah, that financial value is certainly a reflection, however imperfect, of the artistic revolution he helped start. His impact on 20th century art, particularly on the German expressionists who saw him as a direct forerunner, was absolutely massive. He fundamentally shifted the paradigm of painting for many, moving it away from external observation towards this deeply personal, expressive confession. He validated their own explorations with his core philosophy. I do not believe in the art which is not the compulsive result of man's urge to open his heart. #outro.
So after tracing this extraordinary, often painful journey through Edvard Munch's life and work, what does it all really mean for us, for you listening? We started with a man absolutely burdened, weren't we? By poverty, by consumption, by the specter of insanity, by the suffocating morality of his father. A man whose early works were literally condemned by critics as the products of a madman.
And yet, somehow he took that incredible stack of profound personal suffering, the anxiety, the grief, the fear of contamination, his deep dive into nihilistic philosophy, and he successfully transmuted it, didn't he, into a universal artistic language.
He really did.
He moved from the isolated trauma experienced in Christiania to become Norway's most recognized artist worldwide, and crucially, the undisputed architect of Expressionism, the father of painting feelings.
It really is the ultimate testament, perhaps, to the power of artistic confession, turning that internal horror, that private pain, into a public language that resonates across cultures and time.
It absolutely is. And Munch himself, remember, believed his art was a voluntary confession. And he aimed it not just at catharsis for himself, but genuinely at helping others achieve some kind of clarity in their own lives.
Which brings us back to the scream.
Exactly. Considering the overwhelming success, the pop culture resonance, the continued, almost frightening power of the screen more than a century later, we really have to ask the ultimate question that Munch posed for himself through his work. Did Edvard Munch actually succeed in his mission to explain life, love, and death, not just to himself, but maybe in some way to the entire modern world?
That's the question we'll leave you to mull over. Does the universal, infinite scream of nature that Munch captured on canvas and paper, does it still echo, even quietly, in your own life today?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.